of the American Psychological Association for 20. Hello, my name is Kurt Geisinger, and I have the great honor of being president of Division 52, International Psychology of the American Psychological Association for 2022. And I want to welcome you all to our webinar series celebrating our 25th anniversary. Being 25 years old is quite an accomplishment for our division, which was founded as a way of saying to the American Psychological Association, we need to be more international, and we are celebrating that. And we believe we have given a lot of leadership on international affairs to the American Psychological Association, and we've seen in recent years just how important that is. Now, as part of this celebration, we have a series right now of 6 webinars, and we might add some more. And among our speakers is a very distinguished group of people, including Denny Wedding and Bridget Khoury and Rolando Diaz-Loving, Janelle Gauthier, Laurie Foster, and Florence Denmark and Harold Takuzian. You're going to hear one of those speakers in the next few moments, and I wish you a great learning experience and a great year celebrating our 25th anniversary. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. My name is Larry Gerstein. I'm the past president of Division 52, International Psychology. I'm real excited and honored to host this celebration of our 25th anniversary and this session featuring one of our past presidents. Thanks to all of you for attending. Our speaker today is a friend, colleague, and fellow global psychologist. She's an incredible human being and professional. Her commitment to social justice, human rights, and fairness have transformed many people and organizations. I know this firsthand from the hours I've spent observing her and interacting with her. Her energy level is boundless, and her ability to address and overcome obstacles and problems is notorious. I can go on about my personal reflections on our guest speaker, but I don't really have the time to do it. So here's the formal intro of our esteemed speaker today. Our speaker is Dr. Bridget Khoury. She's an associate professor and clinical psychologist in the psychiatry department at the Faculty of Medicine, American University of Beirut. She's also the director of the Clinical Psych Training Program, as well as the director of the Arab Regional Center for Research and Training in Mental Health. Her main activities revolve around her clinical work in providing psychotherapy to patients, teaching medical students, supervising psychology graduate students in their clinical training, and conducting research. She's a consultant for the World Health Organization, several NGOs and UN bodies, such as UNFPA, UNHCR, International Medical Corps, and Doctors Without Borders. She's the founding president of the Lebanese Psychological Association and the past president of our division, Division 52. Currently, she holds a number of leadership positions, such as the vice president of the Arab Union of Psychology. She's the executive member of the board of the International Union of Psychological Science and the vice president for the East Mediterranean region at the World Federation for Mental Health. She was recently elected as the vice president of the Lebanese Order of Psychologists and is currently a board member of CODIPAR of APA. Before I turn the session over to Dr. Khoury, let me encourage you to post your comments in the chat or use the question feature. Dr. Khoury will respond as best as she can at the end of her talk to your comments or your questions. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Khoury to deliver her presentation entitled, "What Do Refugees Need and What Can We Do as Psychologists?" Dr. Khoury.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gerstein. It's really a pleasure to be back with the division. It's my second home. It's really an honor, actually, to be conducting one of the webinars for the 25th year anniversary. Let me start by sharing my screen. Okay, can you see it? All is well? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. So let's begin. Of course, now it doesn't work. It's like, okay, there we go. Let me just make sure. So what is the journey of a refugee? What makes a refugee their status? What is the process? So a refugee, according to the UN definition, is any human being who is escaping life-threatening circumstances. And they usually come from countries or communities, societies that have some level of violence and or disasters. So it can be actually both. And they come from countries where they were unable to have their basic needs protected. This is why there's a very big need for them and a push to seek international assistance. There's a difference between refugees and immigrants, and I will get to that as I'm going along, but both of them, refugees and immigrants, seek and deserve basic human rights like any other person around the globe. Unfortunately, as we know, we can't take people out of wars, but sometimes the wars travel with them and we cannot take them out of the people, or it will take a very long time. And this is where our role as psychologists is so important. So some of the factors that make a refugee is usually injustice in their home country, violence, lack of safety, lack of basic needs, lower to middle socioeconomic status. And we have a number of countries, as you know, and unfortunately ending up with Ukraine as the last country with refugees seeking help and seeking refuge. Now, there are differences between refugees and exiled. And the difference is actually the educational level and the opportunities. For example, in the Syrian war, we had, of course, many refugees seeking help, seeking a better life and seeking safety in neighboring countries like Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. And they were refugees and they were received as refugees and given the help and the assistance that refugees get. Usually they did come from lower to middle socioeconomic and they had limited resources. The educated group from Syria, for example, those who were doctors, who were psychologists, who were engineers and lawyers, did not come as refugees. They came as exiled, mainly seeking employment. They had the education, and many actually ended up being in Europe working in their fields because they had the opportunities. So unfortunately, the socioeconomic background that one comes from determines whether one will be a refugee versus one will be in exile. Now, of course, the exile, they also have their own set of problems, but that's another presentation. So from their home countries, they go into transition countries. Most of the time, it's almost very rare to go into the settlement country that they want to get into. And we saw that actually with Ukrainian refugees who really went through the transition countries that were on the border, depending where they were from, Poland, Romania, Hungary, etc. In the transition countries, however, they also do face discrimination, injustice, even though the basic needs are provided through NGOs and governments, and these are the services that they receive, there is a resistance to being permanently there. So they resist being in permanent houses, having jobs and putting the kids in school, because to them, they are just transitioning. However, this transitioning can take years sometimes, and they reach what we call a continuous waithood, whereby they are waiting for years and years and years for resettlement. Let me give you an example of COVID-19 in Lebanon and the struggles refugees had. So the refugees were among the last group to get tested if there were symptoms. quarantining was almost impossible because they lived in very close quarters, sometimes in tents or very small rooms or apartments where there were many families sharing a very small space. So if somebody was sick, it was impossible to quarantine. There were little awareness efforts done actually towards refugees. Masks and gels were very difficult to access, almost impossible. And all the NGO services had to be stopped because of social distancing. So around the COVID-19 pandemic, when we were reaching out to NGOs and trying to see how we can help, all of them were saying, we're not going to refugees, we're not going to the specific locations because of social distancing. And we cannot reach them. Of course, not everybody's had internet or access to Wi-Fi to be able to do anything online. So they were pretty much isolated, I think, a lot during the pandemic. And of course, they were also the last to get the vaccines because many were not registered out of different reasons, political reasons, fear of having their record going back to Syria. I'm talking about Syrian refugees. They were illegal. Sometimes they crossed into the country illegally. They were scared or they were not convinced. So the vaccines were also the last to reach them. And then when they get to the host country, there's another set of challenges. The journey itself can be very traumatic and very tedious. And there can also be discrimination and inequity in the host country. Even though it's a country that opened its doors to them, they will still face these problems. Now, the refugees are always bundled in one group with similar needs, yet they're not. They are very varied, like any society in any community. Many are very skilled, many are educated. So we cannot say that they all are lumped in one group. And often, unfortunately, although families try to stay together, they try to keep them together in home countries, the host country, social acquaintances or relations are separated, which of course causes even more problems and less support than what they need. So the journey of a refugee, it becomes relevant only when they cross international borders. So as long as they're in their home countries, of course, they're not considered refugees, though they might be suffering a lot and needing a lot of help. So in host societies, when they arrive, the understanding of refugee is that these people are here only temporarily. They're going to go back to their home countries and they are momentarily relevant. So now we have this problem. If you remember with Ukrainian refugees, they were on the news the whole time, the first week maybe, from every country in the world that they went to in Europe and bordering countries. Now we hardly hear about them. They're not in the news anymore. Although of course they are still there and needing the help and the need that they can get. So when refugees get to a host country, there's a certain power distribution that is assumed. And oftentimes, unfortunately, host communities or international organizations do not treat them as well as we think. And they can be treated as an outcast group and they can be seen as the reasons for problems and many myths that we have or many biases that we have against refugees. And when we get to permanent resettlement, and some people think that, oh, refugees just wait and then they get their papers and they travel, mostly to the West. Less than 1% actually of refugees are resettled. And the term once a refugee, always a refugee, unfortunately, is very true. And this is the difficulty. And we have refugee camps, and that like in Kenya, which is the longest, over 50 years of being a refugee camp and people living in that camp. So then how do we move from being a refugee to being an immigrant? And when one reaches a host country or the selected country or the offered country or then the next best thing basically that they can get is when they become an immigrant and they have to integrate. And there's always some level of forced integration in a way by having to learn the language very quickly, understand the values, the norms, the religion, adapt, not necessarily changing the religion, but adapting to the majority religion that the country has. Now, as immigrants, they have less services than refugees because mostly the NGOs wouldn't be helping or any other associations. And this is where the government services kick in. but immigrants have more rights than refugees, and that's the difference. There are also more expectations. They are expected to seek jobs, to be at work, kids put in school, go to university. Yet at the same time, they are grieving the home country. So they're resettling into this new country, but they're grieving the home country. They try to keep ties all the time. And they try to find their own identity between the old country and the new country, which is always very, very difficult. Another dilemma arises in the next generation, which is how to raise the future generations. And this is where they carry the culture and their old country with them, which doesn't always apply in raising their children. One of the examples is Lara Gul, who's a Turkish young woman in Holland. Her parents immigrated to Holland and she was born and raised there, but born and raised as a Turkish girl in Holland, which of course led to a lot of problems because she was going into Dutch schools. She was, fully integrated in the community, in the society, grew up wanting, abide by the values, which were completely against the Turkish norms. And that caused her a lot of problems to the point that, she was threatened by people in the community. Her family kicked her out. She wrote a book about it and about this dilemma of how to be raised between two countries, between two cultures, and yet finding one's own identity and having a balance or a way of integrating these two cultures in one person. So I worked on the refugee mental health model, and which is I'm going to talk about the 4 phases that the refugees go through, but what are the roles of psychologists in every phase? So in every phase, we have a different role to play. In the preparation phase, which is still in the home country, there's usually providing basic information and guidance. In the transition phase, there's empowerment, motivation. In the arrival phase, assessing the needs and being part of the community interventions. And then in the settlement phase, the clinical care can kick in whenever people need help. So I will go more extensively about that. Sorry. So when we talk about the first phase, the preparation phase, so this is when people are still in their home countries. And the psychologist here is a guide and a resource. So they're in a conflict zone, they want to seek refuge, and oftentimes the mental health care or the whole healthcare infrastructure has collapsed. The psychologist's role here is as guidance, providing crucial information. So these are psychologists who are in the home country, develop certain toolkits with expectation management. And this is where PFA, so providing psychological first aid through NGOs who are already on the ground, can be delivered. Then we move to the transition phase. So let's suppose, I'll take the example of refugees from Syria who crossed into Lebanon now. And again, as I said, transition can be for a very long time. There's a lot of uncertainty about the future. And the education is often absent and they don't want to get enrolled or enroll their children in education, in schools. And here the psychologist works as an advocate and a mediator. The long transition time can be used to fulfill any needs and, of course, mental health care if needed. There's a focus on coping skills, and this is where in transition countries usually, the focus is on the daily life, is on the daily struggles, because this is the most difficult for them. When we did a study about refugees coming from Syria and what they talked about, we did focus groups. And they didn't talk about the war or the traumas or the loss of family members. They talked about their daily life and the difficulty of accessing food, medications, their needs, work, what to do, part-time work or any sort of income, managing to live in very crowded spaces. So that was all they talked about. It was not at all about the war. And here it is important to also help and guide them and in providing education for the children, because the transition time can really cause a lost generation with no education. And this is when also governments help. In Lebanon, we had the governmental schools open in the afternoon for all Syrian refugees, training Lebanese teachers, but also hiring Syrian teachers who were among the people who crossed into the country to deliver the Syrian education curriculum. It's not as ideal as I'm saying, but it really helped and served the purpose. So in transition countries, psychologists can offer psychological services where they feel that people have hardships. And most of the times it's, arriving to the transition, it's the journey, the separations, getting to the transition countries, the losses, all these things that they might talk about, but they might not. But I think it's important for us to have an open ear if they do bring it up. And psychologists play a role in empowering refugees and being a mediator, a lot of times, between the refugees and the host community. Because sometimes they are at a loss. They don't know how to navigate, whether the NGOs or the governmental services. And here we can definitely play a role to help organize activities, help them navigate the system and access their rights and what they need. It's also providing basic information and be really a liaison between them and any non-governmental or governmental body. Now we can also use many refugees that are part of that group to be actually helpers and facilitators between their citizens, the compatriots, their peers, and the community centers. And we see this a lot in countries where the language of the majority is not the language of the refugees. So many times people from the refugee groups who spoke English or French or whatever, or could be actually the facilitators. And we saw this actually in Ukrainian refugees when they reached Europe, is that there weren't many people in Europe or psychologists speaking Russian. It was actually a big crisis about that. And they had some people from the refugees themselves who spoke English or French or whatever language to facilitate and translate and help the interaction and the communication among refugees and the community centers. Now, for those who have a chance to reach the country through family reunification, so they get to a host country, this is when the psychologists need to help them learn about the new country before they reach it, help them have realistic expectations, focus on the skills they have, and assess their need for help, even if that means maybe they need mental health help and they can reach it in this country, and we can bridge that their needs with whatever is offered in that country and already make a connection would be great. Many INGOs work in different countries. So if, for example, the International Medical Corps has a program here, they have another program in Germany and people are going to Germany, the IMC can already establish that referral or that transfer to somebody who can help them there. And that usually helps them a lot so that they arrive and they already have someone who knows about them and can talk to them. And then we get to the arrival to the host country. And here the psychologist is an assessor and a supportive healer. Often refugees do not have the luxury of selecting their host country unless there is family reunification, which helps. But sometimes, as I said, it's any country that opens their door and they just go. So they might not be really ready to deal with that country and they don't know what it is. So the psychologist helps in giving refugees a time to adapt to their new environment, realize that it's okay to and convey that anxiety and insecurity can still be there. It's not, sometimes refugees think that once they get to the host country, everything is going to be perfect and everything's going to be great, it's going to flow. And of course, it's not that easy at all. On the contrary, they have a lot of challenges. Now, finding former refugees to help with the new arrivals is extremely important, because these are people who have gone through the journey, they have adapted, they have settled, and they can definitely help other people who need this help. So when we talk about the host countries, the more acute the situation, usually whenever people are in transition countries and they're desperate, and we have seen this, the less goes into the country of choice, they don't choose it. And we've seen it with people who threw themselves on boats in the Mediterranean, unfortunately, to trying to reach a destination that they do know very little about, but anything outside this area. And of course, many haven't made it. So when the situation is less acute, when there isn't a lot of violence or discrimination, or the choices are a bit wider, and usually they can travel safely into a destination. Of course, it is normal that most refugees would go west, usually to Europe or countries where they have better wages, better opportunities, political freedom, and human rights, which are things that they did not have in their home countries. Now, when they arrive at the host country, they arrive almost at the end of the journey. Usually community interventions are the best because they do not single out specific people. The whole community is taken into account, and it's multidisciplinary, social, psychological, educational, financial, legal. All these services are provided to them. Very important to keep families together, of course, but I also, and I've been asked in several places, I also encourage to keeping communities together, neighborhoods together if possible, because that way the social support is there. They can share the same experiences. They come from this, they have the similar histories, similar experiences, and they are sharing the new ones. And it keeps a certain level of familiarity into their new lives as immigrants. So here, the psychologists can help in assessing the language, academic skills, the education level, basically assessing what are the skills that refugees have, how can they use them best, and be, again, a mediator between the immigrants and the host country and the centers and the government agencies. There will be, of course, crises and immediate problems that are arising, which needs to be addressed immediately, including any mental health services. We know there's an adjustment period for sure. So not to launch too quickly into pathologizing or offering clinical services, but definitely, again, keeping an eye and an ear to people who need the help. Sometimes, often, refugees come from countries or communities where mental health is not very well known. And there's still a stigma attached to it. So having a psychologist as part of a primary healthcare team would be very helpful and more acceptable. So there is no stigma or less stigma like, oh, the head doctor is coming, or the person, who treats crazy people. So, and more, it's part of a primary healthcare team where everybody has a role, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a great way to gain their trust. And of course, the basic interventions, and I always preach that, can always be in groups, which is much better, whether children or adults. And they can be discussion groups, activities, psychoeducational activities. They don't have to be relying only on mental health themes. The last phase, which is the immigration and the resettlement, and this is where the psychologist is a service provider, and a trainer and an educator. And this is where, as I say, trauma travels very well, unfortunately. And when refugees are resettled and have a sense of safety and security, then we can have the latent traumas that come out, and everything that they suffered through might come out. Another thing is the disappointment factor, which can be very present, where, as I said, they expect to be, the host country is like the Holy Grail and everything will be wonderful when they get there. And it hardly is, and it rarely is, because there are, of course, challenges. So keeping in mind and looking and providing and offering the mental health services that are needed, and here they can be probably more specialized, needing referrals, but also focusing on training, and the psychologist becomes a cultural mediator, working on the differences and the commonalities, and trying to bridge and to decrease this level of disappointment and bridge the two cultures together. So when they get to the settlement countries, this is when they're adapting to the language, to society, to the daily life, school, work, university, and that's a lot to take in. And this is when, again, mental health services need to be identified and referred to. if there are needs that are obvious and they need clinical help. As I said, this is when also the traumas can resurface and need some work. Now, we know many refugees come with very heavy histories, with a lot of baggage of destruction, of violence, which puts them at risk for mental health problems. However, it doesn't mean that all of them have mental health problems. Of course not. Some do. The majority might need just basic support. Now, it's important to keep an eye, though, on what is called, unfortunately, collateral damage during violence in a society, which, of course, most of the time is through women, whether harassment, physical and sexual assault, rape, abuse, also towards children, neglect and poverty, and all these problems that they come in with, and it's important to address them and make sure that they do not get worse as they settle. And unfortunately, in the Syrian war, we've seen it a lot that for women, sexual violence and rape really became a weapon of control. We also saw it actually during the Iraqi war. So it was very important to address that. And again, this might not come readily or immediately or early on. It might come much, much later on. So we know that PTSD and depression are often associated with somatic complaints. So it is important to keep in mind that although the concern is not only about meeting refugees' rights for food, movement, and safety, but also to be able to provide them with the services they need. And actually, this was a study done with the Rohingyas of Myanmar, and they realized that all these problems were associated with depression and some PTSD symptoms. Now, again, it's important to be mindful about the journey and the hostilities that they have been through, which could be traumatizing. So it's not only the home country, but it's also the journey, the transitioning. So all these phases can be traumatizing, actually. And again, the difficulty, I think, of resettling for refugees, besides that they are victims of traumas and human rights violations and all that, they lose also the sense of where they belong, what is their purpose and their meaning. And especially when leaving a life that probably was very fulfilling and they had everything they needed on a personal, individual, and community level, and then they're uprooted very quickly and trying to make some sense and regain themselves into a society and a new community that they don't know. CBT and narrative therapy are two that are very much used with refugees, especially with NGOs and community centers. And again, they help in addressing the here and now, but also in, talking about the story and changing it and of course, regaining meaning for it and narrating it into a new story or what they want to aim about their future, what they want it to be. Psychosocial interventions are very common. We conducted a group about teaching women psychosocial skills and problem-solving skills, and they loved it. It was so helpful for them. Psychoeducation also plays a very important role. So when we get to the settlement, the care is not acute anymore. So it's more having a community-based program where people trust these programs, trust the helpers in it, and go there to seek the healthcare, mental health care, any needs they have, because this will plays an important support system for them. Now there's a lot of apps being done for refugees to whether screening for problems, accessing help, accessing basic services. So I think every month we hear about a project or a new app that is being designed especially for refugees. In a study that dealt with Somali refugees, actually in Boston, there were 4 resources that were very important for them: the religious and faith source, healthy communication, support networks, and peer support. These 4 pillars were very important for them and almost prevented mental health problems getting worsening as they settled. So I will leave you with this conclusion: to provide a comprehensive and effectively competent service and intervention, psychology should base itself in social justice. Otherwise, professionals will underemphasize major predictors of the well-being of oppressed communities and overlook important factors needed to help in the recovery from mental distress. So I think my presentation really touched on all these points. And I think we cannot emphasize enough the importance of social justice and human rights when we talk about psychology. I don't think really mental health can exist without these concepts. Now, I wouldn't be Lebanese if I don't give you a quote from Gibran Khalil Gibran, who wrote about home, and he said, "What is home? And if you read it from a refugee's perspective, my house says to me, do not leave me, for here dwells your past. And the road says to me, come and follow me, for I am your future. And I say to both, I have no past, nor have I a future. If I stay here, there is a going in my staying. And if I go there, there's a staying in my going." And this is how a refugee thinks when it comes to leaving home and trying to recreate a new home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khoury. What a brilliant presentation. You talked in less than 30 minutes, but you provided such rich information, practical ideas. And the other thing that was really poignant for me is that you modeled some of the best behaviors of what it means to be an international psychologist. You touched on language, values, context, norms. It was interdisciplinary, so I really, really appreciate what you had to say. There's a number of comments in the chat thanking you, also asking for the PowerPoint, which Dr. Bullock said would be available on the website. Sure. I think, are you seeing the chat? Dr.
Yes.
Dr. Bullock had a question for you. Do you want me to read it, or?
Yes, I can. There are many that Mary, let me see. Oh, here we go. Thank you for one question. You mentioned that only 1% of refugees are resettled. Does this include refugees who become immigrants to new countries? Yeah. Yes, exactly. These are the refugees that become immigrants. So the other 99%, well, I mean, I don't have the percentages, but either stay in the transition countries, and this is why it can take forever, or if their home countries are safer, they can go back to them. I'll give you the example of Lebanon. When the Syrian war started, within 2 months, we had 2 million refugees crossing into Lebanon. Lebanon is a country of 4 million population. So imagine 50% of our population, was refugees. Of the 2 million that was back in 2011, 2012, most of them stayed here, or they went to neighboring countries, Turkey, not Jordan, but mostly they crossed to Turkey because they were hoping to then go to Europe. Many of them stayed in Turkey, but also a few, very, very few were able to make it to Europe. And now when I'm talking the 1%, these are the officially who are resettled through UNHCR and have the papers. I'm not talking about the illegal ones who try to make it, and sometimes they do make it illegally. And the rest, they went back to Syria because not all of Syria was unsafe. So now from the 2 million, we're down to maybe 600 to 700,000 refugees. So it really dropped. Again, the majority going back to Syria, a few to Turkey, and very, very few who resettled. So yeah, unfortunately, again, the transition is not a transition when it comes to the life of a refugee. It can be more permanent than they would like it to be. I'm talking about Syrian refugees. I think Ukrainian had a different experience, which I'm waiting to get some data from there. And it was easier for them because they were already part of Europe to cross into European countries. So people outside Europe, what's more difficult for them. And the US and Canada are much more difficult to reach geographically. So this is why they cannot, I mean, very illegally cross to the US. It's way, way too far. Sorry, Larry.
Oh, sorry, I interrupted you. Yeah, Monica has a question.
Sure.
It's at the bottom of the chat there before.
Okay, yeah. Are the portion who are, if they remain in the transition countries, are they considered stateless? Yes, they're refugees. So it means that they have very few rights. They get services. And it depends on the government and the how rich the government is to provide them with, education, jobs. For example, refugees are not allowed to work officially. They do under the table, they get paid, again, not unofficially, but yeah, they cannot work. They cannot, they will never become part of the fabric of that country. We have the experience of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon who have been here since, some of them since 1948, some of them since 1967, in Palestinian camps, again, unable to work. They go to the schools in the camps, and that's one of the main issues why with Syrian refugees, the government did not want to make camps again because of the experience with Palestinian camps who became actually cities now. They're within the city. So they did not want to take the risk again of having them stay for, over 50 years and unable to be part of the country. So yeah, unfortunately they're stateless in the country where they're in transition, but they can go back to their own country and they're okay. Okay. Desiree has, are you of the refugee Ukraine situation are doing anything different from previous refugee situations? Yeah, since research such as yours has helped currently. What's very sad is the last time I gave a presentation about refugees, it was actually the same day the war started in Ukraine. And as I was talking, refugees were being produced. I mean, it was absolutely horrible. So I think with Ukraine, it's a bit different because they are part of Europe. So they were allowed to cross into Europe, and many European countries, opened their doors. I mean, and we heard, of course, a lot of the, biased discourse about refugees from Ukraine versus other refugees, and we've heard it all over the media. But in Europe, they had an easier time, but that doesn't mean it was easy for them. But the services were better. They were familiar, I think, with the structure of some countries. The difficulty that they had, and I can tell you about Holland because I have colleagues in the Netherlands. When I was there and over Easter, we were discussing it. The language was a main barrier because, of course, in Europe, very few would speak Russian. And this was one of the main issues that actually was a barrier to them seeking services or, trying to access, especially mental health services. So they were looking for people, translators, anybody who speaks the language to become a translator or a mediator between the services and Ukrainian refugees. Now I'm not sure what's happening. I know in Europe, many people opened their homes for them. It's not like they were in camps. They were put, in homes, and now how much were they able to? It's too early to say anything about it. It's been too soon, and I know that some of them have tried to go back actually to Ukraine. That's what I've heard. Kathy, bring science and compassion together creates a whole story. Yes, I mean, God, I hope science and compassion go together. I would hate to see one without the other. And that's how, I mean, we are psychologists at such a perfect place to integrate both. because we have learned both and we're trained in both and we know both. And we're experts in human behaviors and human emotions. And we are definitely placed to be able to play such an important role when it comes to vulnerable populations. So yes, thank you for highlighting that, Kathy. How much have you heard about art therapy as another approach? Oh, okay, yeah. That was used a lot actually with children, and art therapy also, puppet therapy, music therapy. I mean, all art therapy was really used, especially with children. It was very, very helpful with some women's groups also. Interestingly, it was one of the way to get women into groups to start talking. Is like, okay, let's, you know, teach you, I don't know, drawing on silk, for example, or making this or that. And then it started through art, and then it developed sometimes into more process groups or support groups or whatever they wanted to talk about. With women, it was very interesting. The groups, initially there was resistance for any group, but once they got in and the group gelled together, they became such an important support system for each other that even when the group stopped, women continued meeting and being together and exchanging things. And this was, I think, you know, the hidden outcome that came out of the women's groups is, you know, creating this bond between them that was very supportive, and they, you know, they could always meet. We did the same groups, the problem solving groups with men. It was a completely different dynamic. I mean, it was much more difficult actually to conduct. And it took a very long time for them to be able to trust each other, being able to be open. So it was more difficult, but it was good for both, I think. What are the situations of refugees with disabilities and chronic health conditions? Oh yeah, also those who identify as LGBT. Very difficult. I mean, especially those with disabilities or chronic health problems, although NGOs definitely gives them a priorities. And they are the ones who access the services first. And, you know, if they're identified and being able to be offered these services, they are definitely offered first. And even people with mental health problems, you had many people from Syria with chronic mental illnesses who did not have their medications. Nobody knew what was wrong. And so they, you know, they had to be again, be part of the system, being re-diagnosed and provided services. With LGBT, it's very difficult. We have an NGO in Lebanon, actually, which is very underground. It specifically caters to Syrians who are LGBTQ. Now, interestingly enough, because Lebanon discriminates openly in the sense that it's a law or that discriminates against LGBTQ community, they have access to immigration much faster. So they can actually go to Europe through kind of a much faster process because they're LGBT and discriminated against and at risk of being hurt and being, you know, subjected to violence, etc. But it's not easy. It's not easy at all. But I know many NGOs have tried to provide them these services, but there's a specific one for LGBTQ population who are from Syria and who offer these services. So yes, they're trying to do the best that they can. Art therapy and arts making bridges cultures becomes a third language. Yes, and a way to communicate. Yes, absolutely. There are many things that bridges cultures together. And I think, again, art is one way, compassion is another. People are the same everywhere. I always say that. They are the same everywhere. And what they want, their needs are the same everywhere. Everybody wants to be happy. Everybody wants to live with dignity. Everybody wants the basic needs fulfilled. This is everywhere in the world. And this can be achieved, of course, with, you know, the right combination of government, non-governmental, but also health workers who are trained and able to provide these services. One of the things that I always see is lacking in the training and education of psychologists is actually social justice and human rights. This is not taught much in university. This is something that they acquire later on if they're interested in. But I think this should be part of the core curriculum, actually, to teach about these topics, especially when we are looking at a global psychology and a globalized world. This is what's needed. And one of the things that I always cite is that at some point in a psychologist's life, they will interact with a refugee. So in their career, at some point, they will be interacting with somebody who came from somewhere else, and not in a very nice and easy way, and they are suffering from it. So I think this is really crucial to be part of the training of future psychologists. I don't know if there are any other ones. Did I miss anything, Larry?
No, you have
Okay.
not. I've got a question for you while other
Sure.
people are thinking of questions. So I was curious if you can talk a little bit about how psychologists that are doing the kind of work that you talked about today take care of themselves and deal with burnout and stress.
I don't think psychologists take care of themselves enough, to tell you the truth. I think we preach, but we don't practice it. And, you know, unless we constantly need to be reminded. I have seen workers in NGOs, for example, who always, you know, have support groups. And interestingly enough, I've had several NGO groups who we run here from our department and offer them the support they need. So it's somebody from outside the NGO who is offering them the support they need, and they come into groups, you know, once a week. We had, and this is very important. Now, what's also very important is actually for the management of whatever organization to be aware of that and to know that there is a high burnout rate. It's very tough to hear the whole day stories that are heart-wrenching. It is very tough, and you cannot but take them home with you sometimes. And we're talking about, you know, it's like I always say, you see the worst of human nature when you see refugees and the impact violence and discrimination and violation of human rights have done to them. And you deal a lot of times mostly with women and children, which are also, you know, vulnerable groups. So it's very, very tough to keep a perspective that is healthy. So supporting each other is very important. Having access to people outside the community center or the NGO or whatever to access help from is also very important. And, you know, sometimes we just say, you know what, I need a mental health break. I need to just not come and take off for a day or two and just regain some perspective. So this is, you know, we try to encourage this as much as we try to practice as much as possible. But, you know, we need to keep it in mind, and we need to be reminded, I think. That's very important also.
You've got two other questions here.
Yes. How does telemedicine make psychologists potentially more accessible to refugee support? Are there easy ways to address the interjurisdictional issues between countries? Thank you, Diana, for these questions. Telemedicine, yeah. Unfortunately, not many refugees would access telemedicine or telemental health. Although they have access, they have phones, they have Wi-Fi, they have internet, but it's not, a lot of times we've seen it during the pandemic again, that it wasn't very easy for them to accept, you know, seeing a doctor if they need to, or a psychologist on telehealth. Now, I can also tell you sometimes resources are very limited. They might have internet or Wi-Fi or whatever on their phone to access their families back home, to, you know, use their phones for what they need, but not to use it for telemental health. The other thing is that because they live in such crowded centers or homes, it's also not easy to have the privacy to be able to engage in telemedicine. So there are many obstacles that, this is why they're relying on apps now. They're trying, like WHO is developing apps, and every single, you know, NGOs or engineering with medicine program is developing some app for refugees, hoping that, you know, that might fill in a bit the needs that they have. So the interjurisdictional issues between countries, no, of course there are no easy ways. There's nothing easy between countries that can be solved, unfortunately. But this is where I think the accessibility of services and through what way are they accessing the services that can sometimes play a role, and again, be a mediator and informer about what they need to know and learn about the various legal parts and, you know, laws and regulations and policies about different countries. But sometimes when it comes to issues of, you know, divorce or custody, it's very difficult as a refugee, for example, to divorce in Lebanon. It's very difficult. You know, they need to go back to their country where the marriage happened, etc. So that took in 50% of their population. In your opinion, did it lead to more hostile? What is the situation now in terms of resettlement of Syrian refugees within Lebanon for those who didn't leave? Yes, we were surprised too, actually. Did it create hostile? It depends where, and it's interesting. Depending where the refugees crossed, which part of the country, some parts of the country were more helpful and more open to receiving them than other parts. Some parts had to do with the differences in religion. If they crossed into sometimes more Muslim villages and towns, it was easier to accept than in more Christian towns. So there was tension for sure, but there was also a lot of, openness and willingness to help. And I mean, again, Lebanon is not a rich country, evidently, but one thing, for once, the government did right, and I don't know how they did that, is to open the borders and say anybody can cross in if they're at risk and etc. And that was the only good thing they did. So now, as I said, in terms of resettlement, again, we're not we're not a host country, we're a transition country, because no one can become a citizen here as an immigrant. There are many, many laws and regulations about it. So they are still, unfortunately, in transition. And this is why I said many left back to Syria, to areas that are safe, and many crossed to Turkey, hoping to reach Europe from there. Some succeeded, unfortunately, some didn't, and lost their lives in the Mediterranean. The process of what have we learned and what does it mean for the maintenance of moral standards in societies? Okay. That's a big question. Thank you, Larry. So am I supposed to answer that, or what about the moral disengagement? What you posted here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I inadvertently posted that. That's our next webinar in our
Okay.
webinar series. Sorry, Brigitte.
Okay, no problem. No, I was wondering, like, oh my God, you want me to go into this now?
Probably
That's another 3 hours.
Probably you could. You got 1 minute.
There you go.
I think you had one other question. Do you also utilize social workers in your work?
Oh, I missed that one.
Yeah,
yes,
before
of
my
course,
era.
Absolutely. And we never have enough. And they are amazing. They are so resourceful. Yes, absolutely. Pretty much all NGOs and NGOs use social workers. They are a very important part of health workers and service providers. They actually do things that psychologists don't do. They go to the homes, they assess the situations there. And they are a lot of times, the eyes and ears of psychologists on the ground. So yes, we do, and they are wonderful. So we also have them in our department, and we absolutely cannot do anything without them. So yeah.
Thank you for all your great questions, and for your willingness to respond to them all, Dr. Brigitte. This webinar, including the PowerPoint, will be available on the Division 52 website. I just put the address on there, and I also let you know that there's another webinar coming up in celebration of our 25th anniversary on June the 8th. So I invite you all to attend. It's free like this one. Spread the word. And great to see you, Brigitte, and
Thank
great to see
you.
everybody in
It's-
the.
Thank you so much for attending and for the questions. And I hope I will see many, many of you in Minnesota. I'm hoping. And thank you. It's wonderful to be home again with Division 52.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Wow, you blew it. Hey, Luca.